You've heard the story, tea, taxes, and a revolution. But that's just the cover story. For over 2 centuries, history books have sold us a neat, patriotic version of why America goes to war. But the real triggers, backroom deals, economic pressures, and political gambles are hidden in the shadows. So grab your tinfoil hat, or just an open mind. It's time to uncover the stories you were never told. The British East India Company was more than a business. It was an empire, with its own army, navy, and vast territories. But by the 1770s it was failing, burdened by corruption, famine, and debt. The government stepped in with a bailout, the Tea Act of 1773. This act gave the company a monopoly on American tea, bypassing colonial merchants and undercutting competitors. It wasn't just about tea, it was a weapon of mass economic disruption, disguised as a bargain. Colonial merchants were the engine of the economy, shippers, importers, even smugglers. The Tea Act threatened their livelihoods, giving the East India Company a monopoly and setting a terrifying precedent. This wasn't just about taxes, but economic survival. So when tea ships arrived in Boston, the merchants acted, destroying the tea to send a message London couldn't ignore. Perfect. The Boston Tea Party was a meticulously planned act of industrial sabotage by the Sons of Liberty. They targeted the British East India Company's tea, worth nearly $1 million today. This act triggered London's harsh response. The Intolerable Acts aimed to crush Massachusetts. This united the colonies, leading to the First Continental Congress. The path to war had begun. The War of 1812's official reasons, British impressment, interference with trade, and support for native resistance, were real and infuriating. But for the war hawks, young politicians like Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, these grievances masked a bigger ambition, expansion. They saw Canada as a prize, believing Britain was too distracted by Napoleon to defend it. The war, for them, was a chance to seize new land. The Warhawks promised glory, land, and honor, selling the invasion of Canada as a quick, easy victory. They claimed British agents in Canada armed native tribes, justifying conquest as defense. Critics warned it was a reckless land grab that threatened the nation's unity and economy. The real motive, annexation, was hidden behind talk of maritime rights. Congress declared war in June 1812, launching America's great gamble, the invasion of Canada. The American invasion of Canada was a disaster. Old commanders, poorly supplied troops, and militias refusing to fight. Canadians and their allies fiercely resisted. After Napoleon's defeat, Britain struck back, burning Washington, D.C. The war sputtered to a stalemate. The Treaty of Ghent restored the status quo, resolving nothing. America's secret ambition for conquest ended in humiliation, ruin, and loss. Proof that wars of choice can backfire spectacularly. By the 1840s, America was swept up in manifest destiny, the belief that the U.S. was meant to stretch from coast to coast. But this dream meant taking land from others, especially Mexico. Texas and California were the big prizes, and American settlers poured in. President Polk pushed for expansion, ignoring Mexico's warnings. The result, a destiny written in blood. Polk wins the election, and before he takes office, President Tyler pushes Texas annexation through Congress. Polk wants California, so he sends a secret offer to Mexico, while moving U.S. troops into disputed territory. He orders General Taylor to the Rio Grande, provoking Mexico. When Mexican troops attack, Polk claims American blood was shed on American soil. It was a masterclass in political manipulation, a war by provocation. In 1846, Congress declared war on Mexico, swept up by patriotic fervor, but not everyone agreed. Abraham Lincoln and anti-slavery Whigs saw it as a land grab to expand slavery. The U.S. military quickly triumphed, forcing Mexico to cede vast territory. This victory nearly doubled America's size, but at a heavy moral cost, planting the seeds for the Civil War. In March 1861, as Lincoln took office, 7 southern states had seceded, seizing federal forts and plunging the nation into crisis. The last major Union outpost in the South was Fort Sumter, a symbol of sovereignty for both sides. Lincoln faced a tightrope: abandon the fort and legitimize secession, or resupply and risk war. He needed the South to fire the first shot, securing the moral high ground and uniting the North. The fate of the nation now hinged on Fort Sumter. Lincoln devised a brilliant, risky plan: send unarmed ships with food to Fort Sumter. No troops, no weapons, just food for hungry men. He made his intentions public, placing the burden of decision on the Confederacy. If they allowed the resupply, they looked weak. If they attacked, they'd start the war. Lincoln had backed them into a corner, a checkmate on the grand chessboard of the nation. In Montgomery, Confederate leaders debated Lincoln's clever trap. Despite warnings from Robert Toombs, pressure mounted. The order was given: demand Fort Sumter's surrender or attack. At dawn, April 12, 1861, the first shot was fired. The Civil War had begun. The South celebrated, but they had fallen for Lincoln's gambit. The North united, seeing the attack as a strike against the Union itself. There could be no neutrals, only patriots or traitors. In the 1890s, America was booming and looking overseas for influence. Cuba, just off Florida, was fighting for independence from Spain, and the suffering there was real and horrific. But American newspapers, the Yellow Press, sensationalized the crisis, fueling outrage and pushing the nation toward war. Their headlines and stories made the Cuban crisis impossible for Americans to ignore. Amidst media frenzy, President McKinley sought moderation. As a Civil War veteran, he knew combat's horrors. Diplomatic pressure seemed to work. Spain offered Cuba limited self-government. War seemed avoidable, but riots broke out in Havana. McKinley sent the battleship Maine to Havana. Its presence calmed tensions. Then a massive explosion destroyed the Maine. 266 sailors died. The Yellow Press blamed Spain. "Remember the Maine" became a rallying cry. The public demanded revenge. The pressure on President McKinley became unbearable. Despite his reluctance, he had to act. Pro-war sentiment, fanned by the Yellow Press and politicians like Theodore Roosevelt, swept the nation. Resisting war would have been political suicide. On April 11, 1898, McKinley asked Congress for military force to end the fighting in Cuba. He focused on the humanitarian crisis and American interests. Congress declared war on Spain on April 25. Secretary of State John Hay called it a splendid little war. It was short, lasting less than 4 months with low combat casualties. The first major battle was in the Philippines. On May 1, Commodore George Dewey's squadron destroyed the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay. In Cuba, American forces, including Roosevelt's Rough Riders, won key battles. The Spanish military was no match for the U.S. By August. Spain sued for peace. The Treaty of Paris, signed in December 1898, ended the war. Spain ceded Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Guam to the U.S. It sold the Philippines to the U.S. for $20 million. The U.S. acquired an overseas empire. Triggered by an explosion and fueled by sensationalist newspapers, the war blended humanitarian concern with imperial ambition. But the splendid little war had a dark sequel. Filipinos fighting for independence found a new colonial master. They launched a war for independence against the U.S. The Philippine-American War lasted 3 years, costing thousands of lives and involving brutal tactics. The war born from yellow journalism's trigger ultimately dragged America into a long, ugly conflict that challenged its very identity as a republic. America's entry into World War I wasn't just about U-boats or the Zimmerman telegram. The real story? Money. American banks and industries had already picked a side, pouring billions into the Allied cause. If the Allies lost, those loans would default, threatening the U.S. economy. The outrage was real, but the money trail reveals why America truly went to war. So picture President Woodrow Wilson. He's an idealist, a former academic who genuinely believes in American neutrality. He wins re-election in 1916 with the slogan, "He kept us out of war." The American public does not want to send its sons to die in Europe. The isolationist spirit is strong. Wilson is trying to walk this incredibly fine line on one hand, maintaining official neutrality and peace, and on the other, allowing an economic boom that is entirely dependent on one side of the conflict. It's a geopolitical tightrope walk over a canyon of fire. And Germany wasn't just sitting back and letting this happen. From their perspective, the United States was anything but neutral. America was the arsenal and the breadbasket for their enemies. So they declared unrestricted submarine warfare around the British Isles. Their U-boats would sink any ship, neutral or not, that was heading to an Allied port. This was a direct challenge to the American doctrine of freedom of the seas. It was a desperate gamble by Germany to starve Britain into submission before the United States could be provoked into joining the war. And it put American ships and American lives directly in the crosshairs. The sinking of the British passenger liner Lusitania in 1915, with 128 Americans on board, was a profound shock. It generated immense public outrage and was a major turning point in public opinion. But even then, America didn't go to war. Wilson negotiated with Germany, and they temporarily backed down. But the underlying economic reality didn't change. The loans to the Allies kept growing and the shipments of war materials continued. Every ton of steel and every barrel of oil shipped to France was, from Germany's point of view, an act of war. The supposed neutrality was a fiction that was becoming harder and harder to maintain, so for 2.5 years, this precarious balance held. Wilson sent diplomatic notes, the public protested, and the bankers counted their interest payments. But the economic engine of the war was too powerful. The loans had created a situation where an Allied defeat was economically unthinkable for the American elite. The German U-boats were just the final straw, the overt act that allowed Wilson to finally abandon the tightrope of neutrality. He could now frame the decision for war not as a move to protect Wall Street's investments, but as a noble crusade for international law and human rights, a war to end all wars. By early 1917, the Allies were exhausted, financially and militarily. America's economy was deeply tied to their fate. When Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare and the Zimmermann telegram surfaced, the US had little choice. War was inevitable, driven as much by Wall Street's interests as by any patriotic cause. World War II, the Good War. The story is familiar. A peaceful America, shocked by Pearl Harbor, unites for war. But Japan's aggression in Asia and US embargoes made conflict almost inevitable. Japan, desperate for resources, faced a devastating oil embargo. Both sides saw war coming, a high-stakes game with global consequences. This is where it gets really interesting. The United States wasn't just guessing about Japan's intentions, they were reading their mail. Thanks to a brilliant team of cryptanalysts, the United States had broken Japan's most secret diplomatic code, a system codenamed MAGIC. Throughout 1941, American intelligence was listening in on the highest-level communications between Tokyo and its embassies around the world, including the one in Washington. They knew, with near certainty, that Japan was preparing for a massive military operation. This wasn't speculation, it was black and white intelligence. The MAGIC intercepts revealed Japan's diplomatic endgame. They showed that the negotiations being conducted in Washington by Japanese diplomats were largely a sham, a stalling tactic to keep the United States off guard while the final preparations for war were made. The messages spoke of a deadline after which things are automatically going to happen. United States military leaders, including Army Chief of Staff George Marshall and Chief of Naval Operations Harold Stark, were reading these intercepts. They sent out war warnings to American commanders in the Pacific, including those in the Philippines and at Pearl Harbor in late November 1941. But here's the crucial distinction. They knew war was coming, but they didn't know where the first blow would land. The prevailing wisdom in Washington was that the Philippines were the most likely target. It was a United States territory, strategically located, and directly in the path of Japan's southward expansion toward the oil fields. An attack on the remote naval base at Pearl Harbor, over 4,000 miles from Japan, seemed like a logistical nightmare, an incredibly audacious and risky gamble. It was, in military terms, a failure of imagination. So, the warnings sent to Hawaii were tragically vague. They cautioned about the possibility of sabotage or a surprise attack, but didn't convey the same level of urgency or specify the nature of the threat as they might have if they'd pinpointed Pearl Harbor as the target. The base was on alert, but it was an alert against sabotage, planes parked wingtip to wingtip in the open to make them easier to guard, which also made them perfect targets for bombers. The surprise of Pearl Harbor, then, wasn't that Japan attacked the United States. The surprise was the where and the how. The intent was known, the location was a shock. So, on that quiet Sunday morning, when Japanese planes appeared in the skies over Oahu, they achieved near-total tactical surprise. The result was devastating. 8 battleships sunk or badly damaged, hundreds of aircraft destroyed on the ground, and over 2,400 Americans killed. It was a military catastrophe, but from a political standpoint, it was exactly what the Roosevelt administration needed to overcome the powerful isolationist sentiment that still dominated American politics. Before December 7th, a declaration of war would have been deeply divisive. After December 7th, it was a national imperative. Think about the alternative for a moment. What if Japan had followed the smart military plan and only attacked British and Dutch colonies, and maybe the Philippines? Roosevelt would have had a much harder time convincing the American people to go to war to defend European colonial possessions. The America First Committee and other isolationists would have argued loudly that this wasn't America's fight. A direct, stunning, dastardly attack on American soil, however, swept all that opposition away in a single wave of patriotic fury and righteous anger. In the aftermath, conspiracy theories flourished, suggesting that Roosevelt knew the attack was coming and let it happen to get the U.S. into the war. There's no credible evidence for this. It credits FDR with a level of monstrous cynicism and perfect foresight that is just not supported by the historical record. The failure was one of intelligence analysis and imagination, not a deliberate plot. But what we can say is that the attack, while a tactical disaster, was a strategic godsend for the interventionist cause. It solved Roosevelt's biggest political problem in the most dramatic way possible. So the secret trigger here isn't a conspiracy. It's a story of escalating pressure, broken codes, and a fatal failure of imagination. The US used economic warfare to push Japan into a corner, knowing full well it could lead to actual warfare. US intelligence knew the punch was coming, they just tragically misjudged where it would land. Pearl Harbor wasn't a plot, but it was a convenient catastrophe that instantly galvanized a divided nation and propelled it into a global conflict that would fundamentally reshape America's role in the world forever. It was the terrible, bloody key that unlocked the door to war. And now we come to the forgotten war, Korea. A brutal conflict that froze the Cold War into a hot one and set the stage for decades of military buildup. The standard narrative is that the communist North Koreans, backed by the Soviet Union and China, launched an unprovoked surprise invasion of the democratic South Korea on June 25, 1950, and the United States, leading a United Nations coalition, stepped in to defend freedom and stop the spread of communism. And again, that's not wrong, but it leaves out a critical piece of the puzzle, a speech. One single, seemingly innocuous speech. To understand this, we need to go back to January 12, 1950, just 5 months before the invasion. U.S. Secretary of State Dean Acheson is giving a speech to the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. He's a towering figure of the Cold War establishment, with his sharp suit and magnificent mustache. In this speech, he decides to outline America's strategic interests in Asia. He talks about the vital importance of Japan, the Ryukyu Islands, and the Philippines. He draws a line, a defensive perimeter, that the U.S. would guarantee with military force. And here is the crucial, history-altering omission. When Acheson described this defensive perimeter, he left out 2 key places on the Asian mainland, Taiwan, and most importantly, South Korea. He said that any countries outside this perimeter would have to rely on their own self-defense and, ultimately, the commitments of the entire civilized world under the Charter of the United Nations. To an American audience, this might have sounded like a reasonable, measured policy, an attempt to avoid overcommitting US forces. It was a statement of priorities. But in Moscow and Pyongyang, they weren't listening to the nuance. They were looking at a map. And what they heard was the top American diplomat publicly declaring that South Korea was outside the zone of America's vital military interest. For North Korea's leader, Kim Il-sung, who had been agitating for an invasion of the South for years, this was a green light. And for his patron in the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin, who had previously been hesitant to approve such a risky venture, Acheson's speech removed a major obstacle. It seemed to say, "Go ahead, we won't intervene." Now Stalin was not a reckless gambler. He was a paranoid, brutal, but calculating strategist. He had been putting the brakes on Kim Il-sung's ambitions, fearing that an invasion of the South would trigger a direct and massive military confrontation with the United States, a war the Soviet Union was not prepared to fight. The Soviets had just successfully tested their first atomic bomb in 1949, but the US still had a huge nuclear advantage. A full-scale war with America was the last thing Stalin wanted. He needed assurance that the risk was manageable. Acheson's speech provided that assurance. It wasn't the only factor, of course. The communist victory in the Chinese Civil War in 1949 meant that North Korea now had a powerful ally on its border. The US had also completed the withdrawal of its own combat troops from South Korea in 1949, leaving behind only a small group of military advisors. All these signals, when viewed from the Kremlin, pointed to the same conclusion. America didn't care enough about South Korea to fight for it. It was a peripheral interest, not a core one. So when Kim Il-sung went back to Moscow in the spring of 1950 to plead his case again, Stalin finally gave his blessing. He approved the plan and promised Soviet military aid, tanks, artillery, aircraft, but he was very clear that Soviet troops would not participate directly. If the Americans did intervene, against all expectations, the North Koreans and their new Chinese allies would have to do the fighting. It was a calculated risk, based almost entirely on the public pronouncements of the American Secretary of State. What Acheson and other US policymakers failed to appreciate was how their words would be interpreted by their adversaries. They were thinking in terms of managing resources and avoiding entanglement. Stalin and Kim were thinking in terms of opportunity and conquest. The speech was a catastrophic diplomatic blunder, an unintentional invitation to aggression. It's a powerful lesson in how, in the high-stakes world of geopolitics, ambiguity and omission can be just as dangerous as overt threats. They created a vacuum, and the North Korean army was more than ready to fill it. So when North Korean T-34 tanks rolled across the 38th parallel on that June morning, the reaction in Washington was one of shock and disbelief. Not because they thought North Korea was a peace-loving neighbor, but because they had fundamentally miscalculated. They had assumed their subtle signals would be understood, that their implicit power would be enough to deter an attack. They were wrong. The invasion was a direct challenge to the entire American strategy of containment. If one country could fall to communism so easily, where would it stop? President Truman and his advisors, including Acheson, now saw the situation in a completely different light. It wasn't about a civil war on a remote peninsula anymore. It was about American credibility. If the United States did nothing after a Soviet-backed client state brazenly invaded a US-backed one, America's allies all over the world, especially in vulnerable Western Europe, would lose faith in American security guarantees. The line that Acheson had failed to draw in his speech now had to be drawn retroactively, in blood. The decision to intervene was made quickly. Truman bypassed Congress and committed U.S. air and sea forces, and then ground troops under the banner of a United Nations police action. It was a complete reversal of the policy implied just months earlier. The secret trigger of the Korean War then wasn't an act of American aggression, but an act of American miscommunication. It was a diplomatic oversight that had deadly consequences. A war that nobody in Washington truly wanted was triggered by a speech that seemed to promise non-intervention. And so, hundreds of thousands of Americans were sent to fight and die in a place that their own Secretary of State had publicly declared to be outside their defensive perimeter. The Korean War cemented the militarization of the Cold War, led to a massive increase in U.S. defense spending, and locked the United States into a global military posture that persists to this day. And it all started in a very real sense because of a few sentences that were left unsaid in a speech one winter afternoon, a fatal omission that was read as a welcome invitation. In the early 1960s, America was deep in the Cold War, supporting South Vietnam against the North. The domino theory suggested if one Southeast Asian country fell to communism, others would follow. The U.S. supported South Vietnam against Ho Chi Minh's North. Military advisors were sent, a euphemism for soldiers. It was a messy, unpopular situation. To escalate, a clear act of aggression was needed, like Pearl Harbor or Fort Sumter. In 1964, President Johnson got his moment. The stage was the Gulf of Tonkin. On August 2, 1964, the USS Maddox was attacked. This led to a naval skirmish. But one incident wasn't enough for escalation. Johnson needed a pattern of aggression. On August 4th, reports suggested another attack. In the fog of war, that was enough. On August 4th, 1964, the USS Maddox and USS Turner Joy reported a second attack in the Gulf of Tonkin. But confusion reigned, radar blips, phantom torpedoes, and no enemy in sight. Despite doubts from commanders, Washington seized on the incident, leading to the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, America's entry into a decade of war, built on shadows. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution was, in essence, a blank check written to the presidency. It handed over Congress's constitutional power to declare war to the executive branch, allowing LBJ and later Nixon to escalate the conflict in Vietnam to staggering proportions without ever seeking a formal declaration. Millions of American soldiers would be sent to Vietnam, over 58,000 would die, and millions of Vietnamese, Laotians, and Cambodians would perish. The war would tear American society apart, creating a credibility gap between the government and its people that, arguably, has never fully closed. And it all began with a lie, or at least a monumental politically convenient self-deception. Years later, the truth would slowly, painstakingly emerge. Declassified documents, oral histories, and internal reports from the National Security Agency confirmed what many had long suspected. The second attack was a fiction. A 2005 NSA report concluded that there were no attacking craft on August 4th. James Stockdale, a Navy pilot flying over the Turner Joy that night who would later become a POW and a vice presidential candidate, was adamant. "I had the best seat in the house to watch that event, and our destroyers were just shooting at phantom targets. There was nothing there but black water and American firepower." The incident serves as a chilling case study in how intelligence can be manipulated to fit a pre-existing policy goal. The Johnson administration didn't stumble into war because of bad information, they sprinted towards it, using ambiguous information as a springboard. They needed a reason to go big in Vietnam, and the Gulf of Tonkin provided the perfect justification, regardless of its basis in reality. It allowed them to frame the conflict not as an intervention in a foreign civil war, but as a necessary defense of American lives and honor against a hostile aggressor. So, when we talk about the secret trigger of the Vietnam War, it wasn't a communist plot or a grand geopolitical strategy. It was much simpler and much more cynical. It was the transformation of a non-event into a casus belli. It was the story of nervous sonar operators, stormy weather, and ambitious politicians who saw an opportunity in the confusion. They used the fog of war to create a pretext, selling a phantom attack to the American people and Congress, and in doing so, plunged the nation into its longest and most divisive conflict. In 1990, the Cold War ended and Saddam Hussein, Iraq's dictator, faced economic crisis and accused Kuwait of stealing oil. Saddam massed troops at Kuwait's border while the world watched. Days before the invasion, U.S. Ambassador April Glaspie met Saddam. She reportedly said the U.S. had no opinion on his dispute with Kuwait. To Saddam, it sounded like a green light. Now, let's be fair to Ambassador Glaspie. She has always, really strongly disputed the Iraqi version of events. She claims her words were taken out of context, and that she actually delivered stern warnings to Saddam against using force. The problem is there's no American transcript, and while her later testimony to Congress was, let's just say, inconsistent. But even if we take her at her word, her message was part of this much larger pattern of ambiguous signaling from Washington. The official United States policy at the time was one of deliberate ambiguity. The thinking was, if we don't draw a clear red line, it'll keep Saddam guessing and maybe deter him. But this was a catastrophic miscalculation. For a dictator like Saddam, ambiguity isn't a deterrent, it's basically an invitation. He saw a United States that had supported him against Iran, a State Department that said it had no opinion on his conflict with Kuwait, and a Congress that had just voted against imposing sanctions on him. So, he connected the dots and saw a clear path to seizing Kuwait's oil wealth to solve his economic problems. He believed the US, his recent ally, would protest diplomatically, but, in the end, looked the other way. Just like it had with many of his past aggressions. This wasn't just one ambassador's potential slip of the tongue. Just days before Glaspie's meeting, John Kelly, the Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, testified before Congress. When asked about potential US intervention if Iraq attacked Kuwait, he stated flatly that the United States had no defense treaty with Kuwait and no obligation to come to its aid. Imagine you're Saddam Hussein, you hear that, then you hear from the ambassador. The message seems pretty consistent. America doesn't care about Kuwait. It was a failure of diplomacy on a grand scale. So, on August 2, 1990, Saddam's tanks rolled across the border and swallowed Kuwait in a matter of hours. The world was shocked, but perhaps no one was more surprised than Saddam Hussein himself when he saw the American reaction. Instead of quiet acquiescence, he got swift condemnation, crippling sanctions, and the largest international military coalition since World War II massing on his border. The green light he thought he saw had suddenly turned into the reddest of red lines, and he had just driven right through it, setting the stage for war. The American response, led by President George H.W. Bush, was honestly swift and decisive. He famously declared, "This will not stand, this aggression against Kuwait." Operation Desert Shield began, a massive deployment of US and allied forces to Saudi Arabia to protect it from a potential Iraqi invasion and prepare for the liberation of Kuwait. The ambiguous signals were gone, replaced by a very clear and unmistakable line in the sand. But the question remains, why the dramatic reversal? Why go from "we have no opinion" to "this will not stand" in the span of like a week? Well, first and foremost, oil. And Iraq, in control of Kuwait's vast reserves, combined with its own, would have a stranglehold on a huge portion of the world's oil supply. This would give Saddam immense leverage over the global economy, something the US and its allies just could not afford. The principle of national sovereignty was important, sure, but the economic threat posed by an Iraqi-controlled Kuwait was the real driver of the international response. The free flow of oil was, and honestly still is, a vital national security interest for the United States. Furthermore, the end of the Cold War created a new imperative. President Bush spoke of a new world order, a post-Soviet era where international law, not naked aggression, would govern the affairs of nations. Saddam's invasion was the first major test of this new order. Allowing it to succeed would set a dangerous precedent, signaling to other potential aggressors that the law of the jungle still applied. The United States, as the sole remaining superpower, felt it had a responsibility to enforce the rules, to show that invasions for territorial gain were a thing of the past. So the secret trigger of the Persian Gulf War wasn't a surprise attack or a humanitarian crisis, though Iraq's occupation of Kuwait was certainly brutal. The trigger was a colossal diplomatic misreading, a failure of communication that led both sides to miscalculate the other's intentions. Saddam Hussein believed he had a tacit green light from an America that seemed indifferent to Kuwait's fate. The Bush administration in turn was shocked that its policy of strategic ambiguity had been interpreted as a license to invade. It was a war born from a fatal misunderstanding, fueled by oil, and framed as the first great test of a new world order. So, after this whirlwind tour through American history, from the Boston Harbor to the Persian Gulf, what have we learned? It turns out there's like a kind of secret recipe for starting a war. A pattern of triggers that shows up again and again, just with different names and different flags. It seems to require a few key ingredients. First, you need a healthy dose of economic interest, whether it's protecting shipping merchants from cheap tea, making sure war loans get repaid, or keeping the global oil taps flowing freely. Money, it turns out, makes the world go round, and sometimes it makes the armies march. Second, you need a pretext. A clear, simple, and emotionally powerful event that can be sold to the public as an unprovoked attack on American honor or lives. A resupply ship fired upon, a naval vessel mysteriously exploding, a phantom attack in a stormy sea. It doesn't even have to be real, it just has to be believable enough to rally support and get a resolution through Congress. This moral justification is crucial. Wars are messy and expensive, and you can't get a country to sign up for one without a good, righteous reason, even if that reason is manufactured. Oh, and hey, if you think any of these stories are absolutely insane, do me a favor and smash that like button right now. It tells the algorithm that we need to question the official narratives more often. And let me know in the comments, which war do you think has the craziest secrets that we still don't know about? Let's talk about it. And the final, most important ingredient seems to be a failure of imagination, or maybe a deliberate manipulation of information. Leaders who either misread signals or who present ambiguous intelligence as concrete fact to achieve a political goal. From Polk provoking a border skirmish to LBJ selling a phantom attack, we see leaders who know what they want to do and then find the justification to do it. The truth becomes secondary to the narrative. So the next time a leader stands at a podium with a somber face and a resolute voice and says it's time for war, you'll know to look past the headlines and ask, what's the real story?